Reggie here, your friendly neighborhood bodybuilder and comic book collector, and I want to welcome you to another one of my videos. In this video, I'm going to spend some time answering some of your questions with regard to pressing. This is really a follow-up to the three-part series that I released a few weeks ago, where I kind of showed you my process for pressing comics. And in that series, I basically reminded everyone that I was not an expert presser. I was just a guy that had a desire to press some comics to save himself a little bit of money, but also to explore another aspect of the hobby. And I think everyone understood that. But over the course of the last couple of weeks, people have been asking me questions to kind of clarify some things, explain some other things, and to highlight just other aspects of pressing. And again, I'll remind everyone, I am not an expert. There are going to be people that are going to watch this video that in the comment section are going to provide some additional context and texture for some of the things that I'm talking about. And many of these people have a tremendous amount of experience. And so hopefully this video, both my portion and the portion that is provided by others, will serve as a great reference for people to figure out how and if they actually want to press comics. So a few days ago, I put up a post on the community tab. Several people responded, basically asking very direct questions about pressing. So I have my cell phone here, and I'm actually going to rattle off some of those questions that were submitted, as well as some of those questions that have trickled in over the last couple of weeks that I kind of remember from reading all the responses. So let's get to it. The first question actually comes from Tina, and Tina's question is, should a book be pressed more than once? And I think this is a good question. There's actually a little bit of texture to this question, so I want to try to break it down. Generally speaking, I try to press a book one time, if I can. Sometimes it's necessary to press a book an additional time to try to remove the various defects from that comic. Some people have basically said they fear pressing a book multiple times because they feel that somehow or another that book will start to break down as a result of being exposed to the pressing process more than once. I don't have enough experience to dispute that. And so what I try to do again is to try to press the book as few times as possible to remove the defects and get the best result possible. And from what I've seen, most times you can press a book once, especially if it's a modern book. Most of the time, a modern book really only requires a very quick press, and it is beautiful. Older books, Silver Age books, Bronze Age books, depending upon the number of defects, those books could require a couple of pressing cycles. I've done as many as 3 to remove some serious defects in books, but more than likely I can get away with just 1 or 2. If you guys remember that Secret Wars number 8 book that I talked about recently in one of my haul videos or CGC unboxings, I had to press that book actually 3 times. And I still was not able to remove all of the defects from that comic, but the book still came back at a 9.6 with white pages. So you can't really argue with that, and you certainly can't be mad about it. But for me, the goal is to press the book as few times as possible to remove all of the defects. The second question comes from Brian Hart, and Brian actually has several questions, so I kind of spread them throughout this thing. But his first question is, what have you changed up since my first pressing video? I actually took some advice from people that were making comments on my videos, offering a couple of things for me to think about, for a couple of things for me to consider. And so as someone who is not an expert, I wanted to continue learning from those of you out there that have more experience than I do. And one of the things that someone offered up to me was to make a transition from Teflon sheets to parchment paper. And so if you're not quite familiar with it, let me show you what this stuff looks like. This is actually a Teflon sheet. And this is what I originally started pressing my comics with, and I had pretty good results. But again, people started talking about the parchment paper, so I wanted to try that. And before I show you the parchment paper, let me show you one of the concerns. So if you're able to see that, and I'm not quite sure if you will be able to, the Teflon sheets actually have a texture to them. So if you were to press a comic and you were to press it too tightly by, cranking down the knob, you have the potential of imprinting this texture into the comic. And that has actually happened to me. That's how I know that you don't want to over tighten or over press the comic, because you can imprint this texture. And so the idea was that by using the parchment paper, you're less likely to do that. And so I went out and actually bought the parchment paper, which I think is also known as silicon paper. I could be wrong about that. But it looks like it has a texture, but it actually doesn't. So I've been experimenting with the parchment paper over the last couple of weeks, trying to figure out whether I like it better or less than the Teflon sheets. Now, what I can tell you about this is I have had, honestly, more consistent results with the Teflon sheets than the parchment paper. The parchment paper, after you've pressed a couple of books, starts to get some texture to it, a little bit of warping to it. And if you don't immediately throw away that parchment paper and use new sheets, then you run the risk of actually imprinting that wavy texture into the comic. So what I found is that I have to change out the parchment paper often, like every 2 to 3 presses. I have to remove the parchment paper from the press. And so what I was using was one sheet of parchment paper on the bottom on top of the aluminum plate that I put in, and then 2 pieces of parchment paper on the top of the comics to protect from the heating element in the top of the press. So every couple of cycles, I had to basically throw away 3 pieces of parchment paper in order to replace them to prevent that warping from being pressed into the comic. That, to me, it just seems a little wasteful. Yes, I purchased I think a pack of 1,000 sheets of parchment paper, but it just seems a little wasteful. With the Teflon sheets, I've basically been using the same Teflon sheets for 200 or so comics, and I haven't had to throw them out or replace them. Now, that isn't to say that you should use Teflon sheets. What I am suggesting is that people are getting good results with both. And so what you're going to have to do is to experiment and figure out which option you want to go with. What I'm playing around with presently is using a combination of both. And so I am playing around with that to see how I like it. And what I've done is I basically placed a piece of parchment on the bottom of the aluminum plate, the comic on top, and I would place another piece of parchment on top of that, and then the Teflon sheet. And the idea here is that the Teflon sheet gives protection from the heating element up top, but it doesn't run the risk of imprinting itself into the comic because there is a piece of parchment paper between the Teflon sheet and the comic. Clear as mud? Hopefully you guys follow that. But again, I'm just kind of experimenting with a few different things to figure out what's going to work best. At the end of the day, this is what I'll tell you. I have sent in roughly 48 comics into CGC. A healthy number of those comics have come back as 9.6s and 9.8s using Teflon sheets. I feel very comfortable with the Teflon sheets, and I am starting to find a groove and a comfort level with the parchment paper as well. But again, at the end of the day, you're going to have to decide which of these pieces of paper or parchment or whatever you want to refer to it as, which of them is going to work best for you. The third question comes from G. Rios, and he asks, why do you press? Do the books get warped from being exposed to moisture? And I think that's actually a really good question. Well, 2 questions technically. So I press comics because it actually saves me a healthy amount of money. I think a CBCS charges about $12 to actually press a comic. I'm not sure if they have different levels, but CGC charges around $12, and then I think it goes up depending upon the age of the comic. And so by pressing the comics myself, I actually saved myself a tremendous amount of time. And by pressing them myself, it actually allows me to spend more time with that comic, kind of examining it, looking for the defects, and ultimately deciding whether it's a comic that I actually want to submit or not. Because after you press a comic once, then you're able to really look at what imperfections are there and what grade is this comic most likely to receive. My most recent shipment out to CGC, I sent in 20 books. All 20 books are coming back as 9.8s. Now, why is that? It's because I pressed and cleaned each one of those books myself. But before sending them in, I spent some time with those books to know that they should probably be 9.8s before they were even submitted. And lo and behold, all of them are coming back 9.8 with white pages. And not all of them are modern comics. Some of them are actually from the 90s and some of them are from like, a month ago. So, again, there you go. The other question that G actually had was, is there some warping to the comic? And anytime you are exposing a comic to moisture, yes, there is going to be some warping, there is going to be some waviness. And if you take a look at part 3 of the video series that I put together, what I actually do in part 3 is I show you the comic, I show you its defects. I expose the comic to moisture, I take it out of the moisture bath, I show you the comic again, and you can actually see some additional waviness and warping in that comic. And then I put the comic into the press and then show you the effect of the pressing process on that exact same comic. And what you'll see is that the pressing process is effective at removing all of the warping from that comic that was there before the moisture bath, and certainly what was done during the moisture bath is actually removed. And so I definitely encourage folks to go ahead and take a look at that part 3, because it's going to show you the entire process beginning to end, and I don't think that you're going to be able to argue with the results. So the next question is really like a community question. I think a couple of people over the last couple of weeks have actually asked this question. I didn't remember a specific person, but I do remember the question around, can you use warm water in the moisture bath? So here's the thing. Warm water definitely speeds up the process. It also potentially could be risky if you get the water too hot. And here's why I say that. In the moisture bath, if the water is too hot, you have a lot of steam that is coming up out of the water. Because the moisture bath is an enclosed container, that steam turns into condensation in the top of the lid. And condensation runs the risk of dripping down onto the comic. So if you think back to part 1, part 2, and part 3 of the video series I put together, you'll remember that I actually put a cloth between the water in the bottom and the comic up top. And that's really designed to prevent any kind of splashes from underneath. But again, if the water is too hot, that condensation is in the lid and could potentially drop on the comic. So using hot water probably isn't the best way to go, or using water that is too warm or too hot probably isn't the way to go. But that doesn't mean that you have to use cold water. So you can use room temperature water, slightly warm water, and everything will actually be okay. The benefit to using warmer water is that it actually speeds up the process of exposing that comic to moisture and having that comic take on that moisture to make it be a little bit more pliable for the press to do its thing. So you could actually, if you use warmer water, you can actually speed the whole bathing process up to maybe 10, 20, or 30 minutes, depending upon the temperature of the water. But that's not really the bottleneck, right? The bottleneck for the pressing process is the actual time that a comic remains in the press, not necessarily in the bath. So to that point, I don't really see the benefit of speeding up the bath process because the bottleneck is the press. But if you have a need to speed it up, using warmer water is definitely a good way to go. So the next question was actually submitted by Omar, who wanted to know what type of press I use. I actually think I highlighted this in part 1 and part 2 of the previous video series, but to answer the question directly, I use a Transfer Crafts t-shirt press. And I think that I picked this thing up off of Amazon for less than $200, and it works pretty darn well. There is an ample supply of different presses out there for people to use. There are clamshells, there are ones that swing out, there are wider presses, there are smaller presses. There really is an infinite number of options out there. You just have to decide which one is going to work best for you. But the one that I went with actually has a digital display. It has a countdown clock. It has a platform, if you will, that's large enough to accommodate 2 comics at the same time, which allows me to press, more comics during a cycle. And I actually like this press that I decided to go with. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to look at your budget. You're going to have to look at what's available to you and then make a decision based upon that. So the next question actually comes from Brian Hart, and his question is around explaining how long a comic is in the press again. So what I decided to do was I wanted to minimize the amount of time that my comic was actually exposed to heat. Because I don't think that you want to cook the comic, right? You want the comic to heat up in order to remove the moisture from the comic that the comic was exposed to in the moisture bath. And if you think about it, this is essentially what you do when you iron a shirt, right? If you were ironing a shirt or any other item of clothing, what you would do is you would maybe mist it with some water or with some starch or use some steam, where you are basically exposing that thing to moisture, and then using heat and pressure, you are basically extracting that moisture from that item. And by doing that, you're basically leaving that item much flatter than how you found it before it was exposed to moisture, pressure, and heat. Doing a comic book press is really no different than ironing a shirt. It's essentially the same principle. You expose the comic to moisture and then you remove it. And you want to, in my mind, expose that comic to the least amount of heat as possible. So what I do is I warm my press up to about 175 degrees. And it doesn't matter whether it's a silver, bronze, or modern comic, it is 175 degrees. The comic is then placed into the press for 25 seconds. I feel like 25 seconds at 175 degrees is enough time for that comic to cook. Because remember, the heating element is going to take time to cool back down to room temperature, right? So the comic is in there, it's only exposed to that temperature for 25 seconds, but then it remains in there for 4 to 6 hours. And again, it's a combination of heat and pressure that allows that moisture to be pulled out and allows that comic to actually be flattened out. There are other ways that you can do this. I know people that will actually put a comic in their press and they will basically leave the temperature on for an extended period of time. And if you get good results that way, I think that that's what you have to do. But in my mind, I'm always thinking about, if you expose clothes to too much heat over time, that damages the clothes. If you expose hair, like if a woman blow dries her hair too much, too often, then the hair becomes brittle. So in my mind, that also holds true for a comic. So I use the least amount of heat in order to do the most good. And again, if you look at the results that I'm getting with my comics that are going through the pressing process, I feel very, very comfortable with my approach. So the next question is a community question. And this is actually one that was batted about in the comment section for a few days. And it was around this idea of distilled water versus tap water. Several people recommended that I use distilled water because there is a belief that regular tap water has some particles in it that could potentially be absorbed by the comic when that moisture is kind of floating about. I don't know whether that's true or not, to be honest with you. But if there is a risk that tap water could potentially be damaging to a comic, it's almost a no-brainer to just go ahead and use the distilled water. And in fact, I'm actually going to start experimenting with that myself. I don't know if I'll be able to really detect anything one way or the other, to be honest with you. But again, why run the risk? And one thing that I forgot to mention is that I actually don't use regular tap water. I actually use filtered water. It comes out of my faucet, but it's actually filtered underneath the counter. So I kind of forgot about the fact of mentioning that. But again, I'm going to start using distilled water, and maybe you should consider it as well. The next question comes from Eddie's Mullet. And his question is, can you break down the difference between pressing Silver Age, modern, and any other type of comic that might be out of the ordinary? So generally speaking, this is actually a question that has come up from several different people. Generally speaking, my process is the same, regardless of the comic. Regardless of the comic, the moisture bath, the temperature, the cook time, the press time is all the same for me, regardless of what the book is. What I will do, however, is I will make some adjustments based upon the comic. And this is actually something that I did highlight in, I think, part 3 and possibly even part 2. There are differences between Silver Age comics and Modern Age comics, for example, in terms of the type of paper and the type of inks that are actually being used. For a Silver Age or older comic that uses newspaper, what I'll do is I'll typically insert a backing board or two into that comic in order to protect it and to flatten out the covers, and that's more than enough, right? Sometimes I just do one right at the center folds of the comic. For a modern comic, because of the type of paper and inks that are being used, I oftentimes have to insert either parchment paper or Teflon sheets every few pages. And I do this to prevent those pages of that modern comic from sticking to one another. And again, this is really just, it takes some additional time, some additional work, but I do it to prevent those pages from sticking, because sometimes if you pull those two pages apart, they will sometimes transfer some ink between those two pages, or you'll actually pull the ink off of one of the pages. So what I do for a modern comic is that I actually insert a couple of parchment papers or Teflon sheets every few pages of that comic. The other thing that I'll mention is that in modern comics, they sometimes have those digital codes. And if you press a comic that has one of those digital codes, you will actually imprint that square box into the cover of the comic. So what you want to do is you want to check to see whether the comic has that digital code. If it does, you basically want to put a piece of parchment paper or Teflon on either side of that digital code to prevent that digital code, again, from imprinting itself on the pages on either side of that particular comic. So outside of that, the other adjustments are pretty minor adjustments. Again, you want to look at the comic, you want to see where the defects are, and you want to make the adjustments that are necessary. Again, if you are pressing, for example, an annual king size annuals tend to have staples that are in a different place than a regular comic. Sometimes the feet of the comic are at the cover, inside the cover. Sometimes they are in the rear cover. So one of the things that I want to do is, if I'm pressing something like a king size annual, I want to find the staples. Once I find the staples, I then want to try to put a backing board between the cover and those staples to prevent those staples from piercing that cover. Because if you press that book, rest assured that those staples, the feet of those staples will pop through the cover of that comic. So you just want to look at the comic. You want to look for things like the staples, things like these digital codes, and you want to take steps to ensure that you don't damage the book or press a defect into the comic. So while we're on the topic of king size annuals, I actually have a question here from Brian Hart. And his question is, have I ever pressed a king size annual? The answer is yes. And I can tell you that pressing king size annuals or square bound books is a little problematic. And it's problematic because you have to change your setup. And by that, what I mean is that if you are pressing, Silver Age or Modern Age comics, maybe you have to adjust the amount of tension that is on your press ever so slightly because of the thicknesses of the comics that you're working with. But if you are pressing a king size annual, those comics can be as many as 68 pages, if not slightly more. And so what you have to do is you have to actually increase the gap that your press has, right? Because if you go from pressing a 16-page regular comic to a 68-page king size annual, the gap that you need isn't the same. And so what I've done is I typically will take a stack of backing boards. And what I'll do is take that stack of backing boards and I will actually sit it next to the king size annual. And I will kind of eyeball the height of that king size annual against the number of backing boards that I actually need. So then I'll take the stack of backing boards once I have it about right, and I will put them into the press, and then I'll adjust the height of the press to ensure that I don't over flatten the backing boards, thus over flattening the king size annual when I actually put it into the press. And so that's one way that I've been able to very quickly make some adjustments to the height of my press to ensure that I don't actually damage the king size annuals that I'm going to be pressing. I caught a lot of flack for this next one. Caught a lot of flack. There was a question around, why don't you wear gloves when you are handling books? So I am the type of guy that is very hands-on. I don't like to wear gloves. I don't wear winter gloves. I also don't wear winter boots or jackets if I can help it. But it doesn't matter what I'm doing. I am just not a glove guy. And I know that a lot of people out there are. I know that there are people that actually read comics with gloves on. That is not my thing. What I do is I very thoroughly wash my hands before I handle any kind of comic. And then I make sure that if I'm touching a comic, I am touching it as gently as possible. I'm not touching it unnecessarily to handle it. But I'm just not a glove guy. And I would say if you are concerned about the oils in your hands coming off onto your comic, you absolutely want to wear gloves. It's just not my thing. And as I've kind of stated elsewhere in this video, I have sent, almost 50 books into CGC. I didn't wear a glove during any of it, and these books are coming back at 9.6s and 9.8s. That's where my comfort level is, and I think you have to decide what's going to work best for you. So the next question I have comes from Mr. Ramos, and his question is, do you take an eraser to the book before pressing it? How do you clean before a press? I'm actually not going to talk about cleaning a book in this video right now. And the reason for that is that I'm still playing around with a couple of different techniques and approaches for cleaning a book. And I want to perfect some of those things a little bit more before I actually share them with you guys publicly. What I will say is that if you have a comic, you should always clean the comic before pressing the comic. There's no doubt about that. You definitely want to take some time to actually clean it before pressing. And the reason for that is that if the book is dirty, by pressing it, you are basically potentially pressing those defects into the comic in a way that they cannot be removed, right? If you think about it, when you wash clothes, you treat the stain first before washing it, before putting it in the dryer, because if you put it in the dryer and it's exposed to that heat, you set the stain. And so cleaning comics, pressing comics is really no different in that respect. What I will do is I will promise you guys that I will get to a cleaning video at some point. I want to continue working on a couple of things before I do that. But my hope is that that cleaning video will be as well received as the pressing videos that I have already released. And if you are watching this and you haven't yet gone back and watched the 3-part series that I did on pressing, I definitely want to encourage you to do so, because there was a lot of detail and information in those 3-part videos, especially part 1 and part 3. There's a lot in those. So I definitely want to encourage you to go back and watch those. But hopefully you guys found this video helpful. Certainly if you have additional questions, comments, or thoughts, don't hesitate to reach out to me at RegieCollects on Instagram and RegieCollects@gmail.com. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up. And also, if you haven't subscribed, I definitely want to encourage you to do that as well. Take care.